Welcome everybody to WebChat with Minnesota Adult Education. Today is Wednesday, July 10th, and we have a lot to talk with you, to share with you today. So we're excited to have you here. On the agenda for today, we will be sharing some announcements. In addition, we will be talking through the August reporting submission. Then we're going to share some updates on adult education funding. In addition to that, we have the corrective action plan from our federal monitoring visit that we'll walk through with you today. And then we'll have time for your questions. Because this is such a busy web chat, we will be taking questions at the end of each section. We won't be able to address every question in the middle of the sections, but we have time at the end of the sections to take whatever questions that you have. So you can still enter the questions in the chat or click to raise your hand during our question and answer periods. Let's start with some introductions. My name is Brad Haskamp. My pronouns are he, him, and my title is State Director of Adult Education. Glad to be with you here today. I'll turn it over to Julie.
Good afternoon, everyone. My pronouns are she, her. My name's Julie Dinko, and I'm the transition specialist. Hope everyone's enjoying their summer. I'll turn it over to Brandy.
Good afternoon. My name is Brandy Logan. I go by she, her, and I am the HSC and accountability specialist with the team. And I'll turn it over to Neil.
Hello, everyone. My name is Neil Allard. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Records, Communications, and Administrative Support Specialist.
Thank you, Julie, Brandy, and Neil. We do have more folks on the team. Unfortunately, they are not with us today, so you get a small but mighty crew from the Department of Education. Our additional teammates are Jody Versailles, our Program Quality Specialist, Astrid Leiden, our Professional Development Specialist, and Haley Swanson, our Grants, Records, and Administrative Support Specialist. Let's start today with some announcements. First, we want to share just an update reminder about the annual technology fees. This fee, it covers your consortium's use of SID, our statewide adult education database, and our statewide distance learning licenses that each of you can access. For the last 2 years, in 22-23 and in 2023-24, at MDE, we were able to cover those costs with unspent federal funding. That is no longer the case. So we're going back to the normal system, which means that consortia will receive an invoice and a contract from Literacy Minnesota. You should be receiving that invoice here later this week or very soon. Just a note, you've received these invoices and contracts the last 2 years, but did not have to pay the invoice. This year, you do need to pay the invoice. So make sure that you pay that. If you have any questions, you can contact Literacy Minnesota. Another announcement is regarding some new additions to the SID intake forms. There are 3 additional barriers to employment that have been added to the SID intake forms. On these new barriers, you can see them in the SID intake screen and student under history screens. Note that that section was labeled NRS data before. These items are meant to be self-reported by the student. So they would let you know if they feel they have cultural barriers to employment, or if they are an English language learner, or if they have low levels of literacy. Those are the 3 new barriers. We had those off before because we automatically check them depending on whether or not where the individual tested. However, the federal government is requiring that students have to self-report on those 3 barriers. There's more information on the SID help article, and thank you, Neil, for putting that link in the chat. In addition, let's talk about assessments. We have some assessments that are new this year. So remember, as of July 1, some CASAS tests are no longer approved for NRS purposes. That includes CASAS Life and Work, CASAS Beginning Literacy, and CASAS Goals Math. You need to make sure you're using the updated tests CASA's Goals 2 Math, and CASA's STEPS. Also, TABE 13 and 14 will be released soon, and it will be under review for approval in Minnesota. Once it is available for purchase, we will be able to review it as a system, and then we'll evaluate it to see whether it should be approved. Once it is approved, it will be added to the Minnesota State Assessment Policy. We're thinking that that will likely complete, that evaluation process will be completed in late fall. So stay tuned, and we'll let you know as soon as that is available and approved. Let's go to the next slide.
I pause for one question from the chat back on this slide. Jill asked, is the foster care for an adult who received it or if they are providing the care?
It's for an individual who is receiving foster care, someone who is in the foster care system as a child or a minor. Okay. Another update for the year is that we have new measurable skill gains targets. So this year that just completed, our targets for measurable skill gains were 28%. And so that was our statewide target, and that was the same target that we apply to each and every consortium. For this year, you can see that the federal negotiations were a little bit rougher. They forced a big jump on our system. So we're going from what was the target of 28% last year. This year for 24-25, the target is 36.7%. 36.7%. And so that's an 8.7% increase in the target. However, our system was doing really close to that last year in 22-23. So I think that we as a system can meet that target of 36.7%. Next year, that target will be 36.8%. So just a 0.1% increase for next year. But this from last year to this year, that increases more than 8% in the target. And then those targets are important because that connects to our report card and program improvement process. So I'm going to turn it over to Brandy to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Brad. So many of you know that once COVID came and went, we did halt on program improvement. And last year was our first official year back. And so those that don't understand what program improvement are, or maybe just need a reminder, is when report cards come out and that late, early summer, fall, some consortia may be flagged for participation in program improvement. And if you can go to the next slide, please. As you can see with the report card, when it comes out, we'll show not only our targets from NRS, but also our state targets. And that's where you'll see if you fall under that specific percentage. And we will be contacted by us here at MDE, identifying which area you would fall under program improvement and next action steps. If you could hit the next slide, please. And program improvement is for anyone that falls within 30% under. So for example, this fiscal year that we just completed was 28%. So that benchmark is going to be anyone that falls below the 19.6%. And again, with that report card, you'll see it, and then we'll also reach out to you. Are there any questions about program improvement? None in the chat. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Brandy. An announcement about online statewide training courses. We are in year 3 of the pilot. A reminder that these classes are open to all ABE learners who are at the appropriate level for the class, so they can sign up for that. And the referring consortium can count the contact hours. And if we go to the next slide, you can see which courses have been approved this year for online statewide training. And just a reminder that many programs across the state will then take these courses and advertise them in their community education catalogs as a way to get individuals in their local area, giving them access to these courses. So we're running the Microsoft Office Specialist course again, the Paraprofessional Preparation course, TEAS, which is the test of essential academic skills that people who are entering the nursing program oftentimes need that course or need to take that. We have a commercial driver's license preparation course, and a personal care assistant is a new one this year. So please advertise these, promote them, and get them out to your learners so they have access to these courses. Next slide, please. And then just a reminder to people that we have a new IET process and forms. So please do not use the old forms when you're filling out integrated education and training approval request. And this is just a reminder, so please see the link for more information regarding that. And I'm going to turn it back to Brad.
Thank you, Julie. I see there was a question about whether it was last year's classes for the online statewide training courses that were shared or the new link. So the second link that Neil shared actually has the 24-25 classes. So thank you, Neil, for clarifying that. Let's talk, one of the grant competitions that we had this past spring was for our supplemental service grants. And those grantees make up our adult education support network here in Minnesota. So we have awarded these entities a 3-year grant. And so these are our adult education support network providers for the next 3 years. With assessment and support staff training, that's Southwest Adult Education. With digital learning and technology services, that's Literacy Minnesota. With disability services, that is PANDA, based out of Robbinsdale Area Public Schools. Professional development and system support is Atlas through Hamline University. Racial equity in adult education is Southwest ABE through Marshall Public Schools. And then statewide initiatives, conference, and marketing activities is Literacy Action Network, our tech host for today's session. Thank you again, Wendy. And volunteer and outreach services, that's Literacy Minnesota. So these are our providers, the same providers that we had for the last 3-year cycle. They are continuing to be our providers for the next 3-year cycle for these services. So we go to the next slide. There's a quick note about our racial equity and adult education grant. They are developing a racial equity community of practice. And you can see on the screen a lot of the things that that community of practice will do. C and Addie will be leading this work again this year, like they have been doing for the last 3 years. That's C. Mualeski and Addie Woolbaum. And as part of that, they'll be working with the Minnesota Adult Education team at MDE on those grant activities. And so if you're interested in joining this community of practice, look for an application later this month. And please, we encourage you to complete an application and participate in the work if you are interested. In addition to that community of practice, they will also be conducting student focus groups to better obtain information from our learners to make sure that our system is as inclusive and reflects the needs and the voices of our learners. So thank you, C. Yes, we'd love to hear from you if you're interested. Yes, and I can attest that Addie and C are very fun, as well as there's so much to learn and so many insightful conversations that will happen through the racial equity community of practice. So absolutely. Overall, there's a wide variety of professional development options and opportunities for you in the next year. You can take a look at the professional development catalog at the 24-25 professional development dates. There's a a specific link there for those upcoming activities this year. And there's the full calendar on the Atlas website that you can, if you go to their events calendar. So take a look at those resources and you can start planning ahead for you, your staff, your teams, which opportunities are best for you in this upcoming year. So stay tuned and check those resources out. And a couple dates that we want to throw out. Here are some dates in particular that you may want to check out, from Summer Institute to the regionals, the Fall Manager Meeting, Math Institute, our Support Services Conference, and the Minnesota English Learner Conference, as well as Language and Literacy Institute, the Spring Virtual Conference, and our Spring South Regional. A lot coming up this year, and there's many more than that, but these are the big events coming up for the year. And the next big event is Summer Institute. That's coming already next month. This annual conference is going to be virtual this year on August 14th and 15th. There are 37 breakout sessions and 7.5 CEUs that can be earned. There'll be an update from MNABE for staff at the Minnesota Department of Education. There's a trivia night, a vendor fair, and restorative movement. You can see the costs on the screen. Wendy, is there anything more you'd like to share about Summer Institute?
Not at this time, but to register before August 13th so I can get you in on the app.
Excellent. Yes, please make sure you register and register by August 13th. And you can see the costs on the screen. For LAN members, $70. Excellent. Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Literacy Action Network. In addition to that, this fall, there will be a couple of webinar series, one on ABE foundations for those that are new to the system, and that will take place in the month of October. And then our ACES Foundations webinar series, which will take place in the month of November. And so you can take place in either or both of those if you'd like to kind of get a background or you lay your foundation for the adult education system here in Minnesota, or on the ACES Transitions Integration Framework. And we're excited to announce that this fall, the Fall Manager Meeting is going to happen, and it's going to be in person. So save the date for Wednesday, October 30th. I've already heard people ask if they can come in costume. Yes, you can come in costume to this Fall Manager Meeting. We are looking at a date. Wendy is helping to look for a location because Literacy Action Network will be hosting this event, but it'll be somewhere in the metro area. So stay tuned. We'll have that information out to you soon as we can. Also, look next month for registration information already too. So stay tuned. We're excited to have us all together. There's a lot for us to talk about together at the Fall Manager Meeting. And as we're planning, we'd like to know, what do you want to talk about? What topics would you like to discuss with other managers and with the Department of Education staff at the Fall Manager Meeting? Please enter any ideas you have in the chat right now. Please share any ideas for topics, questions, sessions, activities. What do you want? Or if there's something you don't want to talk about, I guess you could share that in the chat as well. But we'd love to get your ideas so that we can incorporate them into our planning for the event. Excellent, Katrina. Excellent. I really appreciate that. If you have additional ideas for the Fall Manager Meeting, you can also email Neil. Thank you for putting that in the chat, Neil. Oh, you're a quiet crew today. That's our last of our the last of our announcements. Before we do that, I think there might be some questions we want to clarify in the stat. Oh, thank you, Lydia. Brandy, are there any
Yep,
questions in the
there
chat?
is a question. So Eric asked, will that go up to 0.7 times 36.7 equaling 25? I'm going to put it in the chat again so it's more current. So you have it right there. That was Eric's question that I just posted in the chat.
Could you read? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading the chat, Brandy. Could you
Well,
please read the question out loud?
Will that go up to 0.7 times 36.7, which equals 25.69 in FY 25 to be flagged? That would be a big jump from 19.6, over 31% higher. And is that
So-
either ESL or ABE levels below the minimum or the average of the two?
Okay, so remember 0.7, yeah, so for 28%, that is 19.6%, that's the program improvement benchmark. If you multiply 36.7% times 0.7, if that comes out to 25.69%, that would become the new bar for program improvement based off of the 24-25 results. So that would be in the report card in late summer 2025. So yes, that is a big jump, absolutely, from one year to the next. Now, most of the programs in the state were above that, and that does apply for ESL overall, and it applies for ABE overall, all the ABE levels. So the ESL levels and the ABE levels, just like how we have applied that in the past. Absolutely. And then I see Karen is adding, just thinking about how utilizing MSGs 3, 4, and 5 could maybe help with this. How is that going for consortia? And that might help with program improvement as well, but that could be a great topic for the fall manager meeting. Yeah. So you're right, Eric. That is a big jump from 28% as our overall state target with a benchmark for program improvement of 19.6%. So this year it will be 36.7%, and then that makes the program improvement benchmark more than 25%. Yes. Any other questions, Brandy?
That is the only question that I see currently, other than the topics that are being put in the chat, which I'm writing down.
Excellent. And I appreciate you for sharing the ideas in the chat for your topics that you'd like to discuss at the fall manager meeting. Excellent. Let's go into our next section here, which is the August reporting submission. The August reporting submission, remember, is due August 1st. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk through some of the overall details. So the due date for the August reporting submission is Thursday, August 1st. Each consortium should be needs to send your completed August reporting submission document, which was emailed to all consortium managers as well as coordinators and lead teachers. Neil has put an example as posted in the chat, the document that is our Adult Education Consortium August reporting submission instructions and document. In addition to that completed document, you'll submit a level gains report, the volunteer required training report, the staff required training report, and the effectiveness in serving employers spreadsheet. All of those can be sent to Haley Swanson via her email. And if you have any questions about that, or if you don't remember that email, you can look back to your emails. Astrid sent this information about the August submission in emails on June 10th and June 12th. We'll be sending another reminder later this month as well, but those will be things that you need to include when you submit that August report, those August reports. So in that August report, there are now 9 sections. This August report continues to get more and more significant and more important based on federal expectations and things that and state policies. So very similar to last year, your level gains and post-test report, the annual volunteer information report, which is a report you complete online. 2 new sections this year, which are printing and sending the volunteer required training report and the staff required training report. And then the other sections are similar to last year as well. The adult education programs collaborating with employers, IET, integrated education and training, workforce training costs, career service costs, consortium one-stop contributions, and verification of your consortium's state ABE calculation for FY25. We'll dive into each of these with a little bit more depth now. Let's go to the next slide and dive into section 1. So section 1 is that level gains with post-test report for all ABE participants. And so you want to utilize the July 1, 2023 to June 30th, 2024 dates for that data. Make sure that all your data is entered through June 30th, 2024. That includes enrollee registration, test scores, contact hours, proxy hours, and diplomas earned. You can download that report from SID, and please attach it to the August submission as an Excel spreadsheet. And then that report needs to include participants and outcomes for your entire consortium, not just some of your sites or not just one of your sites, but an overall consortium report. Okay. In section 2, this is the annual volunteer information report, and you can complete once as an entire consortium, or this section you could have individual providers complete for themselves, whichever makes most sense for your consortium. There are 2 versions of this report. So there's one version for consortia that did not use any volunteers, and then there's a version for consortia that did use volunteers. Make sure you fill out the appropriate report online. And again, you use that date range of July 1, 23 to June 30th, 24. And to help you, you can run the annual volunteer report in SID to get the statistics that you need for the report. And just a note, if a learner or a volunteer fits in multiple categories, just list them once. Just pick whichever one seems like the most, the best fit and put them in that category. You can save progress in this for this online report, and you can complete and make changes later. For more help on this, you can check the webinar recording or the SID Help Center article. You will note here we are not posting all the links in the chat. However, that is in the August report submission document. All of these links are in that document that was put in the chat by Neil earlier. And we will take questions at the end of this entire section. As we go into section 3, this is one of the new sections. This is the volunteer required training report. So this helps to track to make sure that all trainings required by the volunteer training standards policy are entered into SID as an AB volunteer training history item. And those that report can be found on the reports tab when you're in the database in SID. And again, you use that same date range of July 1, 23 to June 30th, 24. And you attach one report per consortium as an Excel spreadsheet. Unless your consortium did not use any volunteers that period, then you would just let us know and not attach the report. If you have any more questions or want more details about how this report works, its features, or how to complete it, you can see check out the SID support help article, which is linked in the slides, but it's also in the August report submission instructions. Then going into section 4, this is a staff required training report. All trainings required by the staff training policy must be entered as an AB staff training history item in the database in SID. And that this report can be found again in the reports tab in SID. Using the same date range of July 1, 23 to June 30th, 24. And just like with the prior section, you attach one report per consortium as an Excel spreadsheet. We do expect one from every consortium because every consortium does have staff. And there's more information in the SID support help article, which again can be found in the instructions document. Then going into section 5, I'm going to actually take a break and hand it over to Julie, my colleague. Julie.
Thanks, Brad. Section 5 has to do with adult education programs collaborating with employers. Again, this is a separate Excel spreadsheet that you complete. And you should document all employers that the consortium has served from July 1st, 2023 through June 30th, 2024. You also need to indicate what type of service was provided. If you aren't serving any employers, you do not need to submit this spreadsheet. And then the next slide goes into the type when they were talking about like what type of service is it. You can review this the spreadsheet before you actually go and complete the form as to how many employers you've worked with. And then if you look at the column on the way right, it says, is this applicable to ABE? And the majority of them are. So when we're talking about effectiveness in serving employers, these are the types of services that we're looking at that we hope that you can document on that spreadsheet. And the next slide gives an image of the spreadsheet. And you'll see here that we ask for the employer name. We also ask for the federal and state employer ID number. If you're having difficulty finding that, if you Google it or something, it's okay just to leave it, and then we'll do our best to either work with DEED or try to locate it on our own. But if it's available, please do enter that information in there. Then we just want the address, the cities, the date of the service, and then kind of the details of the service. And then if you look at that effectiveness in serving employers category, if you can list the number of the service, which was on the previous slide. So that's the effectiveness in serving employers. And then we'll go on to section 6, which is IET workforce training costs. This applies if the consortium was operating an approved IET program. And there were several approved IET programs that were operating this past year. So you have to have an IET program and paid for the student workforce training portion of the IET using state or federal ABE or IELCE funding. So the costs should include staffing, materials, testing fees, or other resources used in workforce training. And what this really is just our federal office trying to gather information about how much of our funding is being used to train individuals for workforce, train individuals for the workforce. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of what the IET workforce training costs look like. So you will be filling this out, this form out. And then we'll go to the next slide. And then we want you to summarize those costs in this screenshot here. So it breaks it down into state ABE grant funding, federal adult education funding, IELCE grant funding, and sometimes people also receive other types of funding, maybe a Pathways to Prosperity grant that covers that cost. We'd also like to know that. So if you could indicate that, that would be great. And moving on to section 7, this is career service costs using adult basic education or IELCE funding. Again, these services cover the last, programming year, July 2023 to June 2024. And many people might be thinking, well, what are career services? Well, it's what you spend on outreach, intake, and orientation information. It's pre-testing skill levels, aptitudes, abilities, and supportive services needs. It's referrals to and coordination of activities with other programs and services. It's sharing performance information and program cost information on eligible providers of education, training, and workforce services by program and provider type. And it's also sharing information on supportive services, assistance, and referrals like childcare, child support, Medicaid, SNAP, CHIP, EITC, all the other supportive services that adult basic education links learners to. That's career service costs. And again, this next slide is going to show you a little bit about, this is a reminder that in the past, the state used to estimate these costs, or we asked you to estimate them. And you'll find out a little later in the web chat that we now require grantees and providers to calculate the cost for career services. It was part of our cap, and that's why we can no longer estimate these costs. We actually need calculated costs. And every adult education consortium provides career services. Entering a cost as 0 for this section is not accurate. You all provide hopefully an orientation, intake, etc. for the learners that are coming to your programs. And again, examples include staffing, test materials, and other relevant resources. And then we'll move on to the screenshot of what this kind of looks like, the career service cost table, the type of funding, state funding, federal, i.e. IELCE grant funding, or other funding sources. So that's it for career services. And we'll move on to Section 8, which is the consortium one-stop. In Minnesota, that's Career Force Center and systems contributions. So many of you are familiar with the infrastructure funding agreements with the workforce development areas where your consortium is located. You will need that information in your contribution. So if one consortium within the workforce development area makes the contribution on behalf of multiple ABE consortia, then only that consortium that makes the contribution should document the contribution, so that we're not getting duplicate contributions recorded. We only need the one contribution. Next slide. This is where you would report it. This is what it looks like. You just list the workforce development area where your consortium is located. And then what type of the amount, obviously the amount, and if you're using federal, state, or in-kind contributions to make that one-stop contribution. Next slide. Okay. I believe this is back to Brad now.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with Section 9, this is verification of your state adult education aid, the initial calculation for FY20, fiscal year 25. So with that, you do not need to wait till August 1st in order to make any corrections here. But what you need to do is review your consortium state aid calculation. In particular, look at the contact hours for your consortium. Does that match what you put in your annual application? Does that match what you have in SID? Look at school district members. Is that accurate? And look at any other data that you can see that you might be able to verify that is used to calculate that state ABE aid for the consortium. If you see any errors, do not wait till August 1st. Please contact Jody Versa at her email as soon as possible. Okay. So that is all of the sections. I see that there are quite a few questions in the chat. Don't worry, we have time now to dive into those questions. Brandy, can you help me sort through those questions?
Yeah, so the first is, what is the expectation for who in the consortium sends the report? Example, coordinators, data managers, etc.
Yep. So overall with this August reporting submission, we require one report from each consortium, from each grantee. And so that typically falls on the consortium manager or whoever the consortium manager designates to submit that on behalf of the consortium. So all you that are our fiscal agents, our consortium managers, we're looking to you to decide whether you're going to submit this and pull this all together, and or who is going to help pull this together and who will submit this. But it's the consortium manager's decision.
Perfect. The next question is, I'm a little confused. We updated our training to match the new policy with core module 1 and 2. Those trainings are available options in SID, but the report goes back to foundations 1 and 2.
So there's a couple things that you can do there if it's not matching in SID. Option 1 is you can email the SID team, and I'll put that in the chat here. Just 1 second. Let me get that email up for you. You can email SID support if you have any questions about how that report looks in SID. The other thing that you can do is if you have an old volunteer that's been around for a while and they were either grandfathered in or the training just isn't showing up, but you entered, there's a space in the August reporting submission document where you can tell us any additional details, anything that you want to clarify that might not look right in the report, or anything about the report that might stand out that you'd like to explain. There's a little box in that section, and just enter that data. Just let us know that data in that box, in that text box in the August reporting submission report.
Perfect. Another question is there people including staffing costs for intake orientation for every student?
Yes, so any student that you do intake on, that counts as career services. So if you have one person who's full-time job, or their entire job as a part-time person is to do intakes, all of their salary and benefits could count as career service costs. Any staffing costs that go towards providing program orientations, towards any of those listed career service costs, the career service costs are listed in the August report submission document in that section, and that is kind of directly from what the federal federal definition is. So if you look at section 7 of the August reporting submission document, the outreach, intake, and orientation, those 5 bullets, those are exactly how the federal government defines those services. And you do your best calculation to document those actual costs of how much you spent on those types of services.
Wonderful. We have 2 more questions. Please repeat where we can find examples of career services cost. Example, what does it mean by staffing? All staffing costs, ? Only intake for certain classes, etc.
Yep. So again, the career service costs are identified. Their federal definition is provided on page 10, which is section 7 of the August report submission document. If you want to dive in and talk a little bit more about how do you calculate staffing, like the staffing costs and the benefits and everything, how do you create that? How do you determine the cost? You can, and if you need more detail than what's provided in this document, you can call or email me, and we can talk through it a little bit more in depth.
Wonderful. And I was incorrect. That was the last question. If I did
Oh.
not get to your question, please shoot it to me, but I think I got them all.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Brandy. Yeah, we have a minute or so if there's anyone else that wants to raise one more question.
I'll just add, Brad, that I did add a table in there, table C from one of the Teagles that talks about the career and training services.
Thank you,
that
Julie.
apply to adult ed. Yep.
Okay. And I see a question in the chat from Nadine. What if we have not finalized your IFA, your infrastructure funding agreement yet? That's okay. So what we need to know is what you spent out between July 1, 2023 to June 30th, 2024 for infrastructure costs. So if your total amount that you have spent during that period was like whatever you spent and paid out during that period, that is what you should include. So even if your IFA is not current or up to date or developed for this upcoming year, we're looking at last year's costs. Please let us know what you spent in last year's costs. And if you haven't spent anything because that IFA is not yet finalized, then I guess you would put 0 in that case. if you truly did not spend anything in the infrastructure funding agreement. Julie, am I saying that correctly, or do you want to correct me there?
No, you are correct. However, you're out of compliance, and I realize that's not just on adult basic education. It's something we're working on with all the WIOA partners to try to have that done. They were supposed to be done no later than June 30th of this year.
Thank you. Yep. All right, let's move ahead. Don't worry, we will have time for any questions that we did not answer. If new questions come up for you about topics that we've already addressed, we'll have time at the end. But let's dive into the next topic, which is adult education funding. As we get started, we want to lay the groundwork. What are some key terms to remember here as we talk about our funding? We've already been utilizing several of these, like FY24, FY25. FY stands for fiscal year, and our fiscal year goes from July 1 to June 30th. In state fiscal year terms, FY24 is July 1, 2023 to June 30th, 2024. So that's the year that just ended, and we've just launched now into FY25. Some additional terms that are needed is UFARs. This is the codes that we use for fiscal reporting and financial reporting for all MDE grants and grantees. So whether or not you're a school district, you still need to use UFARs and report all of your expenditures via UFARs because that's how our reports are generated and organized. FIN 322 is the financial code. It stands for Financial Identification Number for our state adult education or state ABE funding. And FIN 438 is our federal adult education or federal ABE funding, grant funding. And funding is often used as to be synonymous with aid. Sometimes some people use that as synonymous with entitlement. Either way, it means money. So let's first talk about the year that just ended, FY24, and our funding. On the next slide. So there is still time to use FY24 state ABE funding. So remember, up to 20% of your state ABE funding can be spent between July 1 and September 30th, what is often called quarter 5 of the following fiscal year. However, when you carry over funds in this way, you need to be very careful to code them correctly in UFARs using the correct course code. So the correct course code to utilize FY24 money in the first quarter of FY25, the course code needs to be 004 for any of those funds spent at that time. And then year by year for that FIN 322 funds, in this for FY24 funding spent in the first quarter of 25, that's 004. Next year, the FY25 money that will be spent in the first quarter of 26 would be course coded 005. And you can see that pattern as we go forward here. Please make sure to course code that money correctly. If you do not course code that money correctly, your consortium could actually end up losing that funding. And just make sure, if you have not done this already, work with your business office to draw down your federal FY24 federal funding, the FIN 438 funding. That is downloaded and can be taken out drawn via SERVs. Oh, we use so many acronyms, don't we? Remember, federal funds are treated differently. Unlike state funds, they cannot be used after the June 30th date. And you have to work with your business office to draw those funds from SERVs and do that quickly. It's really a pain if they're not drawn down in a timely manner. You might need to revise your budgets to match expenses. And then that means you have to resubmit a budget, and that needs to be approved by MDE. Please do all of this work ASAP, but no later than September 30th. We understand that many of you cannot do this alone, that you need to work with your business offices to make that happen, but please contact your business offices, check in, and make sure that that funding is being spent and spent correctly and drawn via SERVs. Okay, so that's last year's funding. Now let's talk about FY25 funding. So this is the FY24 money is the last year that we're going to be using SERVs. Starting in FY25, our federal money is going to be going through MEGs from one acronym to the next. And so these changes, starting with FY25, you already noticed that with the grant application. That application for state and federal adult education funds was submitted via MEGs, that new system. The old money, the FY24 money, that was done via SERVs. FY25 federal adult education funds will be distributed via MEGs. What is not changing though is how we handle the state money. State adult education funds, the FIN 322 funds, those funds will continue to flow through ideas. And someday those acronyms might make sense to you, but poof, it's a world of bureaucracy. So what can you do right now? What you can do is look at the initial state ABE awards that Jody sent out were sent out via email. Those initial ABE state funding award amounts are now also posted on the MDE website. You can see an example of what that report looks like here. Now, where to find it? We're going to see, you'll see an email sent by Neil on June 27th that has these initial allocations. Neil has also put in the chat a direct link to get to this adult education entitlement report and then a couple of details about that on the next slide. Just a note, if you don't have the direct link, you can still get there from the MDE website. It's a little bit of a trail. If you go to the MDE website at education.mn.gov, and if you click on Data Center, you then click on Data Reports and Analytics, and then you click on Adult Basic Education Entitlement Report. That's how you can get there if you don't have the direct link. Now, to get your consortium-specific FY25 state ABE aid initial funding calculation, you click on the year of 2024. That's the year that the money is initially issued or allocated. Then for your consortium, you click on your consortium's fiscal agent. Not maybe the name that your consortium uses, but who is the actual fiscal agent from your consortium? Is it like Bloomington Public Schools or Brainerd Public Schools, or is it American Indian OIC? Then you click on Run Report, and then you can see your consortium's entitlement or initial aid calc for the FY25 year. And as we look at this, there's a couple things that just to remember to look for. You want to make sure your contact hours are accurate for your entire consortium. You want to make sure that all of your school district members are included on that list. And you want to make sure that any other data is accurate as far as you can verify. If you find any inaccurate data, email Jody as soon as possible so we can make a correction. I will say we've already received 3 consortia that have come to us to note that something was submitted incorrectly. So then we've already done some adjustments. A couple adjustments happened before the initial aid calc, but we've already had to do an adjustment after the initial aid calc. If all data appears accurate, then you can just simply verify that and check that on the August submission document when you submit that. Let's go to the next slide. So here you can see exactly what you should be looking for when you pull up this report. So here's an example of Metro South's adult education FY25 allocation. You can see that we picked year 2024. And the consortium is, the name of the consortium is Metro South, but the fiscal agent is Bloomington Public School District. And they ran the report. You can see that they have the Bloomington, Edina, Eden Prairie, and Richfield school districts all as members. And then you can see that their total contact hours was 186,249.75. So those are some key points of data that you want to check and verify for your consortium to make sure that that is accurate. And just a couple notes about this total state funding for FY25. The total amount of state ABE aid increased 2% from last year. So from 53 million to 54 million, which is great. Adding on to that, though, is that hours from last year to this past year that was just wrapped up, which is May 1st, 23 to April 30th, 24, there was actually a statewide increase of hours of 16%. So the growth in contact hours far outpaced the growth in funding. So you can see where this is going as we go to the next slide. That means when funding grows less than the contact hour growth, that means the contact hour rate goes down. So when the initial run, you'll see that the FY25 contact hour rate is $9.64, which is a significant decrease from the FY24 contact hour rate, which was $11.05. Just note though, because we have received a consortium reach out to us to say, oh, the contact hours were wrong for our initial submission, we need to adjust that in MEGS. We already have done a rerun. It's not, you won't see that on the initial, on the MD webpage yet, but that's going to drop already. We're probably going to see at least a 4% drop in that FY25 contact hour rate based on adjustments that have been made as consortia have caught errors in what they submitted. Now note that change in contact hour rate from $9.64 to $9.60, which you can't yet see. And that change, that's only the current initial change. If other consortia find additional errors, that could continue to change or adjust the actual FY25 contact hour rate. Note though that that rate of $9.60 and from 964 to 960, you might not actually see that if your consortium hits one of the two caps. If you hit that contact hour revenue growth cap, or if you hit that gross revenue per contact hour cap, you might not see the adjustment from $9.64 to $9.60. So you might be immune to that if you've hit either of those caps. As you can see, our funding gets messy. So the timeline looking ahead. So as soon as possible, I cannot stress this enough. Every consortium manager, along with your business office and your SID staff, should be looking to verify all the data with that initial calculation. If you find errors, please report them to MDE, to Jody as soon as possible, and then they can be corrected before we run our final calculation. At the end of July or in early August, we'll complete a final calculation. And then in August, we will be issuing award letters, including final amounts of state adult education funding and federal adult education funding. And then you'll know your official allocation at that point in time. So we'll take some questions about funding, but just as you're prepping your questions, just a key message, an important message to remember. We use this description frequently, but think of state adult education funding like a pizza. The state legislature determines the size of that pizza. The legislature determines the size of the pizza based on the allocation that they set that year. MDE, our role at the Minnesota Department of Education is to calculate the size of the slices for each grantee according to state statute. So the legislature bakes the pizza and determines the size, and at MDE, we're just slicing it according to state law. Okay. Scott, in terms of federal pizza, you find out about the federal pizza or your federal allocations in August when we do the final allocations, when we have the final allocations ready, because again, as individual consortia find out that they reported the wrong contact hours, or if we need to make any changes to what's reported in contact hours, if we did a data entry error, then that will adjust how much each consortium gets. So we won't have those final federal allocations until we have the final state allocations, which will be in August. And in terms of who decides what toppings are on the pizza, I'm not even getting into that. Oh, Brandy, what other questions do you see in the chat?
The pizza was the only one because Scott found his answer as soon as you continued to speak. So we're good to go, I believe, so far.
Okay. Any other questions from folks? Just giving myself a little bit of a time check. Okay. Okay. Let's go into the next. Oh, I see a question from Dad. Do we anticipate flat funding from federal funding? Yeah. So our federal funding is roughly flat. IELCE funding actually went slightly down, and our federal adult education funding went up maybe 1 or 2%. But for the most part, it feels like flat funding from the federal government. So you'll see. So the total amount of federal funding going out is roughly equivalent to last year. Good question, Deb. Okay. Let's go into the next section. And now our one of our final sections of the day. Whew, this is a very information heavy web chat today. I will tell you, it's not a light and breezy summer session. But let's talk about our corrective action plan. So as you remember, a little bit of background. In late January, early February of 24 this year, we received a site visit and federal monitoring visit from staff at the U.S. Department of Education from the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, also known as OCTE. And they were here to monitor the Minnesota adult education system. They did a full monitoring visit that included 5 areas that they investigated. Performance accountability, fiscal, state leadership, competition and monitoring local programs or local grantees, and WIOA shared monitoring issues. So those were the modules that they looked at while they were here. And from that monitoring visit in January, February, at the end of March, they shared with us a final report from that monitoring visit. This report contained 2 noteworthy practices, 2 highlights, 12 findings, meaning issues that we have to correct, and 30, connected to those 12 findings, 32 required actions that we need to take. That is a significant number of actions that need to be done. So that is a lot. Let's start with our noteworthy practices, our highlights. Couple things that they really appreciated. One, they really appreciated the Metro North, all of the site visits, but especially they were impressed that Metro North and Minneapolis were co-located with the Career Force centers, with our one-stops. One person at the federal government said that they don't see that very often. So that was a highlight to them, a very important and significant best practice that they saw with our system. So congratulations. Thank you, Minneapolis. Thank you, Metro North, and your co-location and partnerships with the one-stops. And thanks to every consortium with your collaboration with Career Force and your workforce development partners. The second noteworthy practice is the Minnesota adult education work in the support network and our professional development work, including the work that Atlas does. They thought that our professional development was very robust and a best practice that they thought was extremely noteworthy and a highlight of our entire system. Now, what are some of the things that we need to fix then after this? So in the month of May, our Department of Education staff, it was adult education staff, fiscal or finance staff, grant staff, and MDE leadership. We submitted a corrective action plan, or a CAP, you'll hear us talk about the CAP, to OCTE. This CAP included strategies, evidence that we will submit, and a timeline or a projected date of completion for each of the 32 required actions based off of the 12 findings. And in the chat, you can see that Neil has shared with you a summary of this corrective action plan that you can have, that for everyone in our system to have, and we share this with any of our partners and others as well. This plan has been approved by OCTE. It has been approved by the U.S. Department of Education. So let's go into the next slide. Now, I'm not going to walk through all 32 required actions because, dear Lord, that would be painful. Instead, I will still walk through 9 of them. And I'm going to talk about the 9 that will have potentially the biggest impact on each of you as adult basic education providers, as consortia, as staff working in local programs. And you can see the list here. That list is also in your summary plan that was put in the chat. But I'm going to walk through I'm going to walk through these 9 and give you a little bit more detail of what exactly they're looking for. So let's dive in. The first one is required action for B, which is we were required to revise the August submission form. And so we had to make sure that we asked for actual costs, not estimated costs. So that was the big change there. And so we submitted that already on May 20th, by May 20th. And we revised that before sending it out to each of you. So now it has the federally approved language, what you received in June. And then just what you report to us and by August 1st, those actual costs that you submit will then help us comply with completing this corrective action plan required action. The next one is required action 1. And you heard me talk about this one already earlier today. We were required to add 3 additional barriers to employment on all of our intake forms. That includes English language learner, low levels of literacy, and cultural barriers. So if a learner identifies that they are an English language learner, if a learner self-identifies saying that they have a low level of literacy, if a learner identifies saying that they have a cultural barrier to employment, they would check those boxes. And the definitions are in that SID help desk article that we were talking about earlier. So by July 1st, we worked with SID staff to make sure that the SID intake form was revised, both the paper form and the SID intake screen. So what you see in SID is accurate and complies with the federal expectation or corrective action plan and required action 1. So what you need to do at the local level is if you're using the SID intake forms, you're fine. If you are not using the SID intake forms, you need to change your forms to add these 3 barriers to your intake forms. A side note here, strong reminder, we encourage you to use the SID forms because they are always up to date and they are approved to meet federal and state expectations. If you are not using those, your local program intake form has to include all the same questions and all the same information that the SID intake form includes. You might be able to add additional questions, but you cannot eliminate any questions from the SID intake form. You have to ask each and every one of those questions on your own intake form. Let's go next slide. The next required action is required action 8A. We are required to inform grantees of what are state requirements and what are federal requirements. So during the 2022 Federal Adult Education Grant Competition, the narrative questions that we asked were not clearly labeled to differentiate which were federally imposed requirements and which were state imposed requirements. So in June, last month, we sent every consortium manager a memo letting them know any consortium manager that has been awarded federal funding as part of the 2022 competition, we let you know in a memo which items we asked were state requirements and which items asked were federal requirements. This does not impact the amount of funding you receive. It does not impact your future funding. It is just a clarification memo. The next required action is about negotiating administrative cost rates. So MDE currently does not have a plan in place, did not have a plan in place for negotiating admin rates with federal funds with local grantees. So by September 1st, we will have that clarified. In the 24-25 grant application for federal funding and the grant award documents for federal funding, you will see language that talks about that process allowing for a negotiation to request a higher administrative cost rate with federal adult education funds. This negotiation process is not on us as state adult education staff at MDE, but it will include MDE adult education staff, MDE finance staff, and MDE grant staff to review and determine whether or not those are reasonable administrative costs. More details about that will be forthcoming as you get your grant award documents. Around the same time, we have another required action that will be due, and that is required action 11, A, B, and C. And that means that, and the federal government is requiring us to revise our grant award notification for federal funding because the current grant award letter does not include all of the language required in federal guidance. So when you get those grant award documents, you'll notice that the federal grant award document will be a grant award notification that looks different and will be in addition to the grant award letter. That new version of the Federal Adult Education Grant Award Notification will be sent to all 24-25 grantees that receive federal funding. That notification will likely be sent via MEGS, our new grant system. Next is required action 4A, tracking and reporting instructional expenditures. So the U.S. Department of Education wants us to submit more detailed information on expenditures broken out by different types of instruction. We're still working out the details on this, so we don't have a lot to share with you now. We hope to have this completed October 1st, but we will have a process in place to track expenditures that will differentiate different types of instruction and differentiate costs by different NRS level. What that looks like is TBD as we negotiate with the federal government on what that looks like. The impact on you as grantees is yet unknown, but we will work with you as soon as we have any additional information on this one. Next, this ties into something else we've already talked about today. Required actions 12B and 12C noted that our workforce development areas in Minnesota do not have up-to-date compliant infrastructure funding agreements or updated compliant memoranda of understanding. And so we need to work with DEED, the Adult Education Consortium, and workforce development areas to obtain current and compliant infrastructure funding agreements and memoranda of understanding. So we are working with DEED and Juanita Borton in particular to help make sure that that happens. And as Julie in particular has been doing a lot of work in this area as well. And we hope to have this item complete by July 1, 2025. And then next, now we're getting out there. Required action 9A says that in our next federal grant competition, we need to have grantees submit a budget that is reviewed as part of the grant review process. So this will take place. The next federal adult education grant competition is currently slated for spring of 2028. And so this action means that we will hope by October 1st, we hope to have the 2028 Federal Adult Education Competitive Grant Award or Grant Competition documents, the process, the applications, and supporting materials, all developed and ready for review for the federal government so that we can launch into that 2028 grant process. Now note that process may take place at a different time if WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is reauthorized. That may throw this timeline off. It might make this date earlier. In theory, it could make it later, but likely not later than 2027. But this also just shows that we're going to be working on this for years. This is a multi-year plan and process, but you'll see quite a few changes potentially with that 2028 grant competition or our next federal adult education grant competition. So Little highlight, 3 out of our 32 required actions have already been closed. We've already completed them. Yay. Our team will continue to work on the additional strategies and required actions over the next 4 years. A final set of required actions will be addressed. The final set will be all part of that next federal adult education grant competition, which is scheduled to run in 2028. Again, that timeline might change if WIOA is reauthorized and requires a competition before then. But that is an overall timeline of this CAP process. At this point, let's open it up for some questions about the corrective action plan.
Yeah, so the first question that I saw is if a student does not self-report as low lit or ELL, but we know they are because of testing, we should leave those fields blank, question mark. Don't check them for the student.
So what you're talking about there is exactly what we argued with the federal government. And what the federal government says is, yes, the learner gets to decide and self-report. However, when we go and do our data match behind the scenes for federal reporting, we will automatically check at least one of those for every adult education learner. But we will work with SID staff to do that. So what you do with intake is you want to make sure that you have those on your intake forms, that you describe the definitions according to the SID help desk article. And if the learner checks it, you can enter it. If they don't check it, you are not forced to check it for them. But behind the scenes, we will ultimately check the appropriate box when we do our statewide data roll up.
Perfect.
So,
And then the new caveat to that was if we're using e-intake. So I'm going to assume that also addresses that question, correct?
yep. So you need to make sure that that with the e-intake, you remember that's kind of a multi-step intake. You still need to address the barriers and make sure that that happens, even if it's not in the initial initial information you collect from the individual. So yes, you still need to do that even through the e-intake process.
And then Susan had a question about a Spanish intake and Mary was able to respond to that. So Susan, unless you still have a question on that, we should be good. And that is all of the questions so far. Oh, for the expenditures by class type, just for federal funds, correct?
The expenditures for class type and level, we have to do that for federal funds and for any funds that we match, any state funds that we match with federal funding, which is currently about 60% of our state AD funds are matched to federal funds. So we have to do that for about 60% of our state funds as well. So that is a process that Jody and I have been doing behind the scenes, and we have to adjust that. We're working with the federal government on how best to do that, but stay tuned. We might have more information to share at the fall manager meeting, but for now, there's nothing that you need to do on your end, and hopefully it stays that way, but we'll be in touch.
And that is all the questions other than Scott trying to put a tug of war together for the federal grant money.
Feel like the federal award competition now has to involve some sort of pizza baking contest, but yeah.
Chili cook-off.
Oh, a chili cook-off. I was using pizza because we always talk about funding and pizza. I see Christian, you added a question here. Did we hear feedback about collection of social security numbers? Oh, so okay. Now you're diving into the between the lines aspects of the federal the federal cap here. So yes, we did receive feedback about the collection of social security numbers. They think that our collection of social security numbers is too low and that we should be doing more to collect more social security numbers from learners that do have social security numbers. And so we'll talk more about this as in the fall manager meeting as well. But there's one I can just say initially, please do as best you can to collect accurate social security numbers from individuals. I know that some of you wait to ask for that until you kind of build a little bit more of a rapport with the individual. And we also acknowledge that you can't collect a social security number from someone that's not willing to produce it or that doesn't have one yet. So that's also a solid truth. I'm not even going to get into what potentially could happen, what are alternatives to that at this point, because that kind of goes into a whole other area. But there's more things that we'll talk about at our fall manager meeting that dive into the like things that we could talk about or think about with Social Security number collection. And Scott was
Are there
asking,
all
what
the
is that
questions
magic
missing?
percentage for Social Security numbers that we're supposed to collect? You should be collecting at more than 60% of your learners' Social Security numbers. So each consortium, we're hoping that you're above 60%, as high as you can go. But 60% is the lowest that we're hoping any consortium is at. Okay.
That's it so far, Brad.
Excellent. Thank you, Brandy. Well, we have a couple closing items, but then we'll open it up for any other questions folks might have. So we look forward to seeing you virtually at Summer Institute in August next month. Hope to see you there. We're excited to see what folks have to present, and we're excited to share what is of interest and of importance to you. And in the chat, you can see there's more information about Summer Institute and in particular about the poster session. At Summer Institute, MDE staff, we will be having our Minnesota Adult Education session for everyone. And we'd like to make sure that the topics we present at the Summer Institute session are of interest to you. So please share in the chat, what topics do you want us to address at Summer Institute in that MNABE session for everyone? What questions would you like us to answer? What things would you like us to say? Is there something you'd like us not to say? Please let us know in the chat. Is there a specific student success story that you'd like to share? You don't want me to walk through the federal cap at Summer Institute, Julia? I understand. Okay. I'm just going to put in the chat here, giving you a chance to think about what you'd like us to address at Summer Institute in the MNABE session or update for everyone. Okay, I'm putting my email in the chat. If you have any additional ideas about Summer Institute, about what you'd like to see in our MNABE update session. Good question. Cindy, is that something you'd like me to address in Summer Institute, or is that something you'd like to talk about here as a question? I'm going to maybe take that as a question, but let's go a couple more slides and then I'll dive into questions. Let's go to the next slide here. So all the materials for today's session, including the slides and the recording, will be posted on the Literacy Action Network website, like always. And Neil has put a way for you to find those web chat materials, the link in the chat. Our next web chat is Wednesday, September 18th. So we look forward to seeing you there. In the chat, Neil has put the registration for the next web chat. So you make sure you register. Thank you all. I really thank you, Neil, for being our slide presenter. Thank you, Wendy, for being our tech host today. Thank you, Julie and Brandy, for helping to run today's session. Thank you to Judy and Kyle for being our outstanding ASL interpreters. And thanks to each and every one of you for all the amazing work that you do, for the important work that you do, for really carrying the system and making the system what it is. So I really appreciate each and every one of you and your efforts with with the adult education learners in our state. Thank you for serving learners. Thank you for serving Minnesota's communities. Okay, and then we'll end on the next slide here with questions. So Brandy, can you help me with any questions that are in the chat? Let's start with Cindy's question that they raised.
Yeah, so Cindy asked, since the English language learner barrier was added, is there space for us to start utilizing ELL rather than ESL and document class names, communications, etc.?
Absolutely. So ELL can be used by your local program, and as you name classes, as you produce any documents, you can use English language learner. Where we still are utilizing ESL is with our national reporting system levels. So those NRS levels do still identify as ESL or ABE levels. So we can't change that, like ESL level 1, ESL level 2. So those official levels are still ESL, but you can call your class ELL classes. You can talk about English language learning. You are not required in any of your local work to talk about ESL compare. You can always use English language learner.
Perfect. And then the next question that I saw was, I'm looking at SID intake and I understood Brad to be saying all programs must collect data for forms asked on the intake. Is that correct? As a correction site, things like phone numbers are irrelevant and often students don't have functional ones. Do we still have to have that on our intake form?
Good question. The federal response is yes. The federal response to that is yes. However, you could pre-fill that out as not applicable for your learners because it is not applicable to that they would have a phone number. That absolutely makes sense.
And I
Yeah.
can just say, when I was doing intakes back in Georgia at the corrections myself, I would put non-applicable and there was no issues with that as well.
Yeah.
And then Susan asked, just thinking ahead, it would be nice to see an example of the budget requirement that will be on the next federal grant application.
Yep. Yes, we will have that ready in 2027.
There was also a question from Cassie. Can we add the SSN question on the e-intake? And Cassie's curious why it's not on the e-intake. They think
Yep.
that it would increase the rate of numbers, and it's a privacy issue if students have to say it out loud after the fact.
Right. So I think those questions can go to Jenny and Mary at SID. So please email the SID staff to talk more about that and how that should be included or would be included. But we need to ask for that information. But like you're saying, Neil, we also need to be careful about data privacy issues and anything else that we need to be like we have to ask the question in the appropriate way and utilize it, and we need to be responsible with how that data is treated. So I can see how with an with the initial intake, maybe you wouldn't ask that, but you'd ask that further as a next step when you're filling out the full SID intake form.
I believe that's all of the questions that I see currently.
Yep. Excellent. Okay. Well, we can stop the recording, Wendy.